In Chapter 20, we switch our focus from microevolution, or the evolution of populations, to macroevolution, or the origin of new species. In Chapter 19, our focus was on evidence for evolution and mechanisms of evolution. There are 4 mechanisms of evolution: natural selection, gene flow, or immigration and emigration within populations, genetic drift, and mutations. Now, certainly all 4 of these mechanisms can lead to the origin of new species. For the rest of this chapter, and for the rest of the semester, if you're in Bio 102, we're mostly going to be thinking of the process of evolution as being pushed forward by natural selection. Just keep in mind those other mechanisms are absolutely at play, but natural selection is probably going to be the predominant factor that is driving the origin of new species. In Chapter 20, our focus is going to be on defining the different species concepts, or providing different ways that we can define what a species is. If you are in Biology 102, you will need to know all 4 of these species concepts. If you are in Biology 101, you need to know the first 2, biological and morphological. And if you are in Biology 102, you can skip the second half of the video where I talk about ecological and evolutionary species concepts. After that, we are going to talk about reproductive isolation and the different types of reproductive isolation mechanisms that lead to new species. And then finally, we're going to talk about 2 processes by which speciation occurs. So the first thing we need to do is define what we mean by species. So we are going to start to define what a species is by looking at the process that leads to the origin of new species. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, microevolution is small-scale changes, and we are looking specifically at changes in allele frequencies in a population. If you are watching this for Biology 102, you would have done this in Biology 101, and so we are not going to go back and do it in detail. If you're watching this for Biology 101, you should have just spent Chapter 19 learning about allele frequencies and how we calculate those. As we get small-scale changes that accumulate over time, those small-scale changes and differences between 2 populations can lead to macroevolution. Macroevolution are the changes that lead to new species, or even a higher classification level, a new genus, a new family, a new order, whatever the case may be, because there are new changes that make these organisms different. And when they are different enough, and I'm using air quotes for enough, when they are different enough that they meet criteria for defining them as a species, we are going to consider them a new species. Now, what that criteria is depends on what definition we're using to define our species, and that's why we're going to talk about some different types. So macroevolution is evolution that occurs as the result of those small-scale microevolutionary changes. And eventually, the accumulation of all these changes leads to a new species. So we can define species very broadly as a group of organisms that share a distinctive set of attributes in nature. Now, this distinctive attributes is going to be important, the distinctive set of attributes. We are going to set what those attributes are based on our different ways that we define what a species is. The most commonly used definition in biology, and the one that is going to be sort of our default, is the biological species concept. And the biological species concept is going to define a group by its ability to interbreed. The morphological species concept is going to define a group in a different way. So whichever we use to define our species, that's the set of attributes that we are trying to set. Now this gets a little muddied. In some groups, some species, we have smaller subgroups that might be just a little bit different. And so we can also look at subspecies. So these are groups of organisms that display traits. Maybe they're genetic traits, maybe they're physical traits, maybe they're their behavior traits that make them very different from other populations or groups within the same species. But they're not quite different enough, again, air quotes, to place them into different species. For example, killer whales are divided into several subspecies, and they are not quite different enough to call them their own species, but they do have different characteristics. Then we might also see ecotypes. These are a population that is specifically adapted to its local environment. So this is usually more of a category than a definition of a new species. Again, they aren't quite different enough to call them their own species, but they do have their own unique traits specific for wherever it is they have evolved. So how many differences? I keep saying enough in air quotes, enough differences to make them their own species. How many differences do we have to have? Well, it depends on the species in question, and it depends on our definition. So for example, the first one we're going to define is that biological species concept. Biological species concept is based on interbreeding. So if two populations cannot interbreed in nature, successfully interbreed in nature, we're going to call them two different species. So how many differences are enough to reduce that interbreeding? It just depends at what point they become so genetically different that they cannot interbreed and produce viable offspring. That might be one change that affects a characteristic of their genitalia, and so they're no longer compatible. Or it might be a slow accumulation of lots of little changes until they're no longer compatible. So there's no set definition. We don't say, well, there are 5 changes different, therefore they are different species. Depends on the change, depends on the definition. So I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there are 4 species concepts. These species concepts are the way that we define a species. And they are all based on different criteria. They're all used for different reasons. There is no single definition of species that is going to separate everybody from everybody else. We had our broad definition on the previous slide that says a species is a group that has a distinguishable set of characteristics. With our species concepts, we're going to define what that set of characteristics is. So the first is the biological species concept. This is basically going to be our default concept for Biology 101 and Biology 102. If we don't know what other one to use, we're probably going to use this one, because it is the most commonly used. If I ask you to define a species, you need to be able to tell me by which definition you are defining it. So if I say, give me the definition of species, you can either say the broad definition is a group with distinguishable characteristics that are different from all other groups, or you could say something like, according to the biological species concept, 2 groups are different species when their members can no longer interbreed with one another in nature to produce viable fertile offspring. Notice I defined it, but I also said the definition that I'm using. I'm using biological species concept. So the basis of the biological species concept is interbreeding. And whether or not two groups can interbreed with one another to produce viable, fertile offspring. Viable means basically living and healthy. So do they produce living, healthy offspring? Fertile means that those offspring, or well, fertile in general means that you have the ability to produce offspring. So there are three criteria actually for this one. They have to interbreed with one another, be able to interbreed with one another, produce healthy offspring that are also fertile, meaning that those offspring can then produce offspring on their own. The reason that we say in nature is that it's not really helpful if the only place that they encounter one another and breed with one another is in an unnatural situation, say on a farm or in a zoo, because that is not representative of the whole population. So if they can do it naturally, produce viable, fertile offspring, then they are considered the same species. By contrast, this means that they cannot interbreed with other species. Just the flip of that. So the biological species concept is used for sexually reproducing organisms. You cannot use this for anything other than a sexually reproductive organism. So that means animals, that means plants for the most part. If they are not interbreeding with another organism, reproduction sexually, then we cannot use this biological concept. So there are drawbacks to all of these species concepts. We all use them for each one for a different reason, and there are all pitfalls or drawbacks to all of them. The drawback of defining a species by reproductive isolation is that sometimes it's hard to determine in nature. So maybe these animals are kind of elusive, or maybe these plants only bloom in a very rare condition, something like that. And so you may not be able to know which individuals are participating in reproduction, or which pollen is pollinating an ovule in a plant. The other problem is that some species can interbreed, but tend not to. So for example, wolves and domestic dogs can generally interbreed with one another, but they tend not to because domestic dogs are kept on property away from wild wolves. Other species are maybe isolated by a barrier that might prevent them. So maybe there's a physical barrier. So they could interbreed, but they do not. So if you never have the opportunity to witness it, how do you know they can actually produce viable offspring? The other drawback to this one is that it cannot be applied to extinct species, because you can't tell from a fossil if one fossil's organism was able to interbreed with another fossil's organism. Just can't happen. So we can't apply it to extinct species. We can't apply it to anything that we're looking at from a fossil that is already extinct. This also doesn't work for asexual organisms. Asexual organisms are organisms like bacteria, archaea, some fungus that only reproduce asexually, meaning they reproduce probably by cell division if you're thinking of bacteria, and they are not exchanging genetic information. Just doesn't work. And that's just because we have defined it based on reproductive isolation. Our second species concept, another relatively common one, is the morphological species concept. Morphology means physical characteristics. So the morphological species concept is based on physical characteristics, physical structure of an organism. This could be anything that you can measure or observe about them: body shape, size, color, pattern, whatever you want to define it as, but you should have a reason to think that the physical characteristics make them different. This one is really nice because you can use it on asexual and sexually reproducing organisms. Doesn't matter because it doesn't have anything to do with breeding. It all has to do with physical characteristics. So we can use this one on microorganisms. We can look at their physical structures to see if they are different. Some of them are still really similar, so we may not be able to solely base this on morphological characteristics. But for example, there are two main groups of bacteria, gram-positive, gram-negative. They have different cell wall structures, and the name gram-positive, gram-negative comes from a type of stain that you use to identify the two different cell wall structures. So we could separate two based on their stain color because they have different physical characteristics as indicated by that stain. So the drawback of the morphological species concept, one, again, how many traits are enough to make them different? There's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. Some traits are hard to put into categories. Some traits are continuous or hard to define. So for example, those beetles on the previous slide, they're all roughly different sizes. At what cutoff point is one different from another? Well, who knows? Maybe we have to look at several physical characteristics before we can define a species. Others are continuous. So the example here is weight. There is no set category of weights for pretty much any organism. There are individuals who are thinner or lighter, individuals who are medium, individuals who are heavier and bigger. There is no set category, so that makes it a little bit hard to define. We might put a category limit, so we might say one species weighs 5 to 50 kilograms and another species weighs 50 to 100 kilograms and the third is 100 to 150. Those categories are arbitrary, so they can be subjective and they can be hard to define. The other problem is that sometimes organisms don't do what we think they should do. So for example, up at the top, these are two frogs of the same species. They look different. They have very different color patterns. So even something that we would consider the same species by other criteria, maybe biological species concept or genetic data, something like that, are the same species but look very different. Other members of different species can look very similar. Remember we talked about mimicry in chapter 43 if you're in Biology 102. Mimicry is where one organism looks like another, usually to a non-poisonous mimics a poisonous or something like that. They use their physical characteristics to deter a predator. So sometimes they look the same even though they are not. Our next species concept, the ecological species concept, is based on the ecological niche or the ecological characteristics of an organism. So if you're a Biology 102, this is the unique set of habitat resources. Some semesters we will have already done ecology, other semesters we will not have done ecology yet. So if we haven't done ecology yet, you should know this term, ecological niche. It's basically an organism's place in the world. It's the set of resources that they require. And so you can kind of think of this as all of the resources it needs to live, reproduce, and do its job or function in the ecosystem. So the ecological species concept defines a group of organisms by their ecological characteristics, by the habitat and the food they eat and the way that they utilize their environment. So if we were using ecological species concept to talk about these three different bears, we might define a polar bear by living in the Arctic, having a set of specific adaptations for that environment, and then also eating a specific diet. So these guys usually eat seals or other larger mammals that they hunt out on the ice. They eat oceanic mammals. And so their ecological niche would be characterized by living in this cold environment and the organisms they eat. Grizzly bears live a little farther south, not quite so cold, but they do still live in cold environments. They are stuck on land, so they're hunting land animals. They eat a lot of fish, they eat a lot of berries. They're interacting in a different environment and in a different way than the polar bear. Same with our black bears. Black bears are much smaller. That would be morphological, but black bears are much smaller. Their fur is black, sometimes dark brown, and they eat even a different set of organisms and live all across the United States as far south as Florida. So they live in a very different environment than either of our other two. So when we use the ecological species concept, we are looking at the organism's habitat. This one is useful for bacterial species and other groups whose reproductive status we don't know, or maybe we can't classify very well based on morphological, and so we can use this one as just another tool. So many bacterial species are defined based on ecological factors. What is their role in the environment? How are they interacting in the environment? What are they utilizing? The drawbacks here, different groups, not necessarily just bacteria, but maybe we're talking about insects or something else. Different groups of organisms may display similar niches, similar ecological interactions and requirements. And so it can get a little muddied that way. Also, some species might show a wide variety in the ecological situations or habitat conditions that they can tolerate and resources they can utilize. So even though they might generally be defined to one or another, they may not actually utilize a particular resource all the time or only in certain conditions. And so this can make it a little harder to use the ecological species concept as well. Our final species concept is the evolutionary species concept. This one is very strongly related to phylogeny, which is our next chapter in Biology 102. Evolutionary species concept defines a group by its evolutionary lineage. Now, this one is really great for extinct species and fossils because we are looking for groups of organisms that are in a line of descent. And when a group or a species, because that's what we're talking about, when a species is different from other organisms in its line of descent, we consider them their own species. For Biology 102, this one's going to become more clear when we start making phylogenetic trees and when we talk a little bit more about the process of building those trees and of the actual evolution of new species. So this one is a little bit hard to see right now, but basically we are talking about when one group branches off from another, and we define them by how they are different from their ancestral species. The evolutionary species concept is generally based on information from the fossil record. It can also be based on DNA sequences. No matter which one you're using, fossil record or DNA sequences or RNA sequences, you're looking for similarities in evolutionary relationships. So the more closely related two organisms are, the more similar their characteristics are going to be, whether those are physical characteristics or DNA characteristics. The other way we can use evolutionary species concept is to define by time or location. And the assumption here is that If two groups or two organisms that you see in the fossil record are separated by a very long scale of time or a very long distance, they were very likely to be different species. And then, of course, we could apply any of the others as well, sort of extensions of that. If they're separated by time, there's very likely to be an interbreeding barrier. So they may not have been genetically compatible and able to produce those viable offspring. And then, of course, location. If they're living in different locations, they're probably adapted to different characteristics of the environment. They're probably not very closely related because they're not interbreeding with other such organisms in a similar location.